Halloween nights in small towns have a special kind of silence. Once the laughter of trick-or-treaters fades and the last porch light flickers out, an eerie stillness settles in. It's the kind of quiet that leaves you alone with your thoughts and your fears. That was exactly what happened to Lisa and James, a couple hosting a small Halloween party with a few close friends. It was a chilly October night, and the mood inside the house was warm and festive, full of laughter and stories about ghostly encounters. Little did they know, their own terrifying encounter was just about to begin. It started with an unexpected knock at the door. Lisa checked the clock. It was almost midnight, long past the time when kids would be out trick-or-treating. Confused, she exchanged a glance with James before heading to the door. Opening it cautiously, she was met with a sight that made her blood run cold. Standing on the porch was a man dressed as a clown, but this wasn't the cheerful kind you see at carnivals. His costume was tattered, the fabric faded and dirty, and his mask, an old, cracked, grotesque thing, seemed too real. His eyes, barely visible through the hollowed-out sockets, bore into Lisa with an unsettling intensity. Without saying a word, the clown slowly extended his hand, as if expecting candy. The air between them felt thick and uncomfortable, and for a moment, Lisa was too frozen with fear to move. James, sensing her unease, stepped forward with a nervous laugh. "Looks like we've got one more trick-or-treater," he said, trying to lighten the mood. He grabbed a piece of candy from the bowl by the door and handed it to the clown, who took it without a word, then turned and walked away into the darkness. But the unease lingered. Something about the encounter felt off, but neither Lisa nor James wanted to admit it. They returned to the party, but the mood had shifted. Their friends noticed their discomfort, and soon after, the gathering began to wind down. By 1 a.m., everyone had left, and the house was quiet once more. Just as they were about to head to bed, there was another knock. Lisa's heart raced. "Who would be knocking at this hour?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but there was a hint of fear in his eyes. He cautiously approached the door, but when he opened it, no one was there. The street outside was empty, the only movement coming from the wind rustling the leaves. He shook his head, convinced it was just a prank. They double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, trying to push the unsettling encounter out of their minds. But as they lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. Lisa bolted upright, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. James nodded, his face pale in the dim light. This time, the knocking wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen. They tiptoed toward the sound, dreading what they might find. Peeking through the kitchen window, Lisa's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the backyard, was the clown. His mask seemed even more grotesque in the moonlight, the cracks on his face casting dark shadows. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there staring at the house. James immediately called the police, his hands shaking as he dialed. When the officers arrived, they searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of the clown, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. They reassured the couple that it was likely just a Halloween prank, but that did little to calm their nerves. The next day, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, and the strange events of the night before almost felt like a bad dream. But when Lisa opened the door to get the morning paper, she found a small, folded piece of paper taped to the door. Her hands shook as she opened it. Written in messy, jagged handwriting were the words, "I'll see you next Halloween." The couple decided not to stay in that house for another Halloween. The memory of the silent, staring clown haunted them. And every October 31st, they couldn't help but wonder if he was out there, waiting to knock on someone else's door. There's a certain allure to abandoned places, especially old cemeteries. They seem to call out to thrill seekers, daring them to come closer, to step onto their sacred ground. That's exactly what happened to three friends one Halloween night. What started as a harmless adventure would turn into a night they would never forget, a night that would haunt them forever. It was the kind of challenge that was impossible to resist. The cemetery had been abandoned for years, its crumbling tombstones covered in moss, the iron gates rusted and hanging by their hinges. Local legend had it that the cemetery was haunted by the spirits of children who had died from a mysterious illness over a century ago. Some said that on Halloween night, you could hear them laughing, calling out to anyone brave enough to enter. Jake, Emily, and Ryan were up for the challenge. They'd been friends since childhood, always pushing each other to do things just a little bit crazier, a little bit scarier. So when Emily dared them to sneak into the cemetery on Halloween night, there was no backing down. Armed with flashlights and an overconfidence that only teenagers possess, they made their way through the dark streets to the cemetery gates. The fog that clung to the ground made everything feel more surreal, as if they were stepping into another world. The moment they passed through the gates, the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Their breath hung in the air like smoke as they wove their way between the tombstones, some of which had long since toppled over. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. But then, something else broke the silence. A faint giggle, carried on the wind, sent shivers down their spines. Jake laughed it off, calling it just the wind. But Emily and Ryan weren't so sure. The giggling grew louder, more distinct, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within the cemetery. It wasn't the sound of children playing. It was something darker, more sinister. Despite the growing sense of dread, they pressed on, determined to prove they weren't afraid. At the center of the cemetery stood an old, crumbling mausoleum. Its stone door was slightly ajar, a narrow gap just wide enough to slip through. "You're not scared, are you?" Jake teased as he pushed the door open wider, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside. Emily hesitated for a moment, but then followed, not wanting to seem weak. Ryan was right behind her. Inside, the mausoleum was freezing, the walls damp and covered in mold. Their flashlights flickered, the batteries straining in the cold. The air smelled of decay, and the silence was even more oppressive than outside. For a moment they considered leaving, but pride kept them from backing down. That's when they heard it. Scratching. Faint at first, but growing louder with every second. It was coming from the sarcophagus in the center of the room. Something inside was moving. Emily's heart raced, her hands trembling as she turned toward the sound. The stone lid of the sarcophagus shifted slightly, as if something, or someone, was trying to push it open. The scratching intensified, followed by a soft, childlike voice. "Come play with me." The words echoed through the small chamber, freezing them in place. Emily's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. They scrambled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of stone grinding against stone filled the room as the lid of the sarcophagus slowly lifted. Jake pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one was there to hear them. Emily felt something brush against her leg, and a scream tore from her throat. The giggling was louder now, surrounding them, coming from every direction. "Come play with me," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. Suddenly, the door flew open, and they stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. They didn't stop running until they were well beyond the cemetery gates, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they finally dared to look back, the mausoleum door was shut tight, as if it had never been opened. They never spoke of that night again. But every Halloween, the memory of that childlike voice, the scratching, and the sarcophagus haunted them. They weren't the only ones who had ventured into that cemetery, but not everyone had made it out. There's nothing more unsettling than the feeling of being watched. At first, it's easy to dismiss as paranoia, just the mind playing tricks on you. But for Sarah, the sensation grew stronger with each passing day, until it became impossible to ignore. It started with small things, The feeling of eyes on her as she walked through her quiet apartment, the prickling sensation on the back of her neck whenever she sat by the window. But there was never anyone there, or so she thought. Sarah lived alone in a second-floor apartment with no balcony and no fire escape. The only way to access her windows was from inside the building. So when the tapping started on her bedroom window late at night, she convinced herself it had to be a tree branch or maybe a bird. But there were no trees near her window and no birds that would tap consistently at the same time every night. The tapping would always come at around 2 a.m., just a soft, rhythmic knock that sent chills down her spine. For weeks, Sarah did her best to ignore it. She would lie in bed, eyes squeezed shut, blankets pulled tight around her body, hoping that it would just stop. But one night, it didn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until she couldn't stand it any longer. She had to see what it was. Her heart pounded as she slowly walked toward the window, her hands trembling as she gripped the curtain. She pulled it back in one swift motion and saw nothing. The street outside was empty, the night calm. Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. As she turned to go back to bed, a shadow shifted in the corner of her vision. It wasn't outside the window, it was inside the room. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly turned back to the window, and there, standing just behind the glass, was a face. Pale, emotionless, and with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark, it stared directly at her. The skin was sickly and grey, the features twisted in an unnatural way that made her stomach turn. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved, and then, without warning, the face disappeared. No footsteps, no sound, just gone. Sarah backed away from the window, her body trembling uncontrollably. She knew she hadn't imagined it, but how could someone be outside her window on the second floor? For the rest of the night, she couldn't sleep. She sat curled up on her bed, eyes locked on the window, afraid to blink. The tapping didn't return that night, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She couldn't shake the sensation that whoever, or whatever she had seen, wasn't gone. It was waiting. The next morning, she called the police. They searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been outside her window. They assured her it was probably just a prank, someone trying to scare her. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the face. Those eyes, cold and empty, burned into her memory. In the days that followed, things only got worse. The tapping returned, but this time it wasn't confined to just the window. Sarah would hear it coming from different parts of the apartment, the bathroom, the living room, even the walls. It was as if something was trying to get inside, trying to reach her. One night, after another sleepless evening, Sarah decided to stay with a friend. She packed a small bag, determined to get out of the apartment for at least a few days. But as she was about to leave, she heard a soft, familiar knock on the front door. Her blood ran cold. The knocking wasn't frantic or loud. It was slow, deliberate, like someone gently tapping with their knuckles. She stood frozen, staring at the door, her heart racing. Then through the small peephole, she saw it, the same face she had seen at the window. Only this time, it wasn't just a face. It was a full figure standing on the other side of the door, staring straight into the peephole. It didn't move. It didn't try to open the door. It just stood there, waiting. Sarah felt her chest tighten as panic set in. She backed away slowly, not daring to make a sound. For hours, she sat huddled in the corner of the room, the figure never leaving the peephole. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that it finally vanished. The next day, Sarah moved out of the apartment for good. She never returned, never told anyone the full story, afraid they wouldn't believe her. But even now, years later, she can't shake the feeling that it's still watching her. It's only a matter of time before it finds her again.